Now when it says before Yahweh, it means this, who stood opposite of Yahweh, in the sense of who confronted Yahweh. In other words, he became an enemy to Yahweh. That's what that's saying. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh, wherefore it is said. Now, when it said, wherefore it is said, he became somewhat of a proverb. And what a proverb is, he made such a name for himself. And if I can use a modern day example, basketball fan, you know, I was a Chicago Bulls fan, and what I would refer to as the golden era, or the Michael Jordan era, you know. So you had new players coming on the scene, and what they would do, they would label them the next Michael Jordan. So Michael Jordan became somewhat of a proverb, and just to give you an example, wherefore it is said, the next Michael Jordan. That's what it's saying about Nimrod. The effect and impact that he had on the world. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. In other words, whenever a great man rose up, they would compare him to Nimrod. That's what it's saying too. It says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Think about that. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. In other words, when you define that term, it means confusion. And it just so happened that it was established in the land of Shinar. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Then it also mentions Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Now I want to emphasize that because now we want to go to the 11th chapter of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. It says, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Now, this is another point of contention among people today. What was that one language? What was that one speech? For lack of a better way of saying, okay, it was what we refer to today as Hebrew, which is a Shemitic language. And what people often do, they like to go back and say, no, the first established language was Egyptian hieroglyphs. Not so. Not so. It was the language that we refer to as, today that is, Hebrew. I mean, not only did the Israelites speak that language, I mean, there's evidence that the Canaanites or the Phoenicians also spoke that language, that Shemitic language, which originally was written, as we see here, with the characters similar to what we find in the Egyptian hieroglyph, which was derived from the Hebraic origin. Okay? But they expanded on it to some degree. And in some languages, what happened, the figures changed. So you have some similarities, but they refer to in the study of languages or linguistics, etymology. You see some words that are similar and relate to or related to one another in other languages, because they all stem from one source. Now, let's talk a little bit. Now, that's literal. There was, at one time in humanity's existence, everybody spoke the same thing. There was no distinction. There was no reason to call it Hebrew or whatever other name or title you want to apply to it. It was unnecessary. But the reason why the differentiation as far as this is Hebrew, this is Russian, this is Chinese, this is Spanish, the reason why is because when the languages were confused, people spoke something different, so now they began to categorize them in different ways. Okay? But anyway, point being, there was one language. Now that's the literal narrative. Now let's touch on briefly what the underlying meaning was. There was one word. The word of Yahweh, Elohim. That was the word. But what we're about to find out with the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom, which was Babel, or which was confusion, we see the adversary's hand that word. Because what we learn from the story, this narrative of humanity, beginning with Genesis, going through Revelation, and some of the apocryphal books, we are learning not only the ways of the Most High, we had also been shown the process of the development of the adversary's ways alongside of it. So when we read about the situation in the Garden of Eden, and now we come to the story of Nimrod and the establishment of Babel or confusion, which was the result of the languages. You see? In other words, it was the result of not just focusing on the Hebrew, but focusing on the fact that it was the word of Yahweh Elohim, which is now being confused in the minds of men. And we're going to see how. It says, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and dwelt there. Okay? Now, I want to tie into this something that Josephus wrote, who was one of the historians. Now, here's another point. We have among scholars, some are for Josephus, some are not for Josephus. That's scholarship in general. Whatever knowledge the intellectuals have come up with, you're always going to have somebody who's for it, somebody who's against it. That's the way of man. That's the example we have today, how things have been confused. Options. And many of these options are based upon opinion. Okay, keep that in mind. So let's touch on some things. So it says, now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. And what I'm not reading everything in order, I'm just touching on different parts of something that Josephus wrote. He says, he persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it were through his means. Keep these things in mind, because we're going to touch on some things now. We mentioned the whole idea of the Luciferian philosophy, that whole doctrine, a little early. We're going to get back to that in a minute. So just keep this thought in mind. Nimrod persuaded them, the people of his era, not to ascribe it to God as if it were through his means they were happy. So in other words, I don't want you to support or believe the word of the creator of the heavens and the earth. I want you to support and believe me, which is how he became a mighty one in the earth. Okay? But to believe that it was their own carriage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. If I can give an example, for those of you who are familiar with the story of the Exodus, compare that to how the Israelites viewed Pharaoh, which is one of the reasons why the Creator said he's going to bring them up. In other words, he has to lift their mentality up so that they get off of this thing about Pharaoh being God, because that's what the Egyptians believed. And we're going to touch on that a little later as well. The Egyptians viewed their Pharaoh as being God. Okay, so the Israelites who are among the Egyptians also had that belief that the Pharaoh was God. So the Creator had to lift them up in order to see that he was the mighty one of the heavens and the earth, and there was none else, in order to bring them out of the bondage. Keep that in mind, because all these things tie into and connect with the whole story of the word. But he said, going forward, when God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. Think about that. Here you have a group of people who are descended from 8 souls that were saved. And I'm sure that Noah and his sons told the next generation and the next generation about why that old generation was destroyed. Okay? So early on, men walked in that fear of the Creator. And they made sure that they were doing things according to what they knew to be prescribed law at that time, or instructions at that time. But here comes Nimrod. Nimrod comes on the scene, and what happens now, things get shaken up. Okay?